Sweden, like most other European nations, had for centuries relied on a few conscripts and mercenaries to make up the bulk of their armies. So raising an army was particularly slow and expensive, and in peacetime there was no real regular force to speak of. So in the 16th century, Sweden tried to change this. So in order to build up a cavalry, they offered tax exemptions to landowners who would support a cavalryman at all times throughout the year ready for war. But for infantrymen, they used impressment. System was expanded upon in 1620, and to summarize it briefly, all men of fighting age had to gather in times of war. They would then be divided up into groups of 10, and one man from that group of 10 would have to go and fight. The other 9, however, would have to pay for his equipment. It's estimated that 2% of Sweden's population could be mobilized and ready in times of war, and it was pretty successful. After all, this was the system that Sweden used during the 30 Years' War to pretty good effect, but it had its downsides. Obviously, many people hated the idea of being forced into the army, and sometimes people could also buy their way out of it, so the army was often left with the poorest and weakest of men. Plus, it devastated local regions sometimes, like the town of Bygdeas between the 1620s and 30s, halved in population from over 500 to just over 200. Plus, the armies during the 30 Years' War were still mainly made up of mercenaries. Sweden's population and this system just couldn't create armies large enough to fight the battles, even though Gustavus Adolphus had merged a lot of them together to form grand regiments. So in 1682 it was reformed, well, improved upon. Now Sweden was divided up into many provinces, and each province had to supply 1,200 men. But these men were given land to live on, and the rest of the population would pay taxes in order to support him. But the enlisted man would have to train throughout the year. This allotment system revolutionized Sweden's army and made the bulk of it. Profession had also served as the basis of their army for a couple of centuries. But this shift in systems may well have been because of a military revolution. Now, this is a contested theory, but to give you a bit of a rundown, cavalrymen had been made less effective thanks to developments like the tercio, a unit made up of swordsmen, pikesmen and musketmen. But this in turn was made obsolete in the 17th century. Dutch and then Gustavus Adolphus instead put pikemen in the middle and musketeers on their flanks, and the formations on the whole were narrower but deeper, giving them more firepower. And the cavalrymen that did remain in the formations didn't shoot and then retreat, instead they continued to charge. Some have suggested that these innovations that were successful weren't because the Dutch and the Swedish were just better military technicians, but in fact that they lacked resources. Their formations were narrower because they lacked men, and their cavalrymen continued to charge because they lacked body armor, but again, this is just theory. But on the whole, improved fortifications known as Tracy Italienne, I'm probably pronouncing that badly, but they made them pitched battles less important because sieges could last a lot longer. Ostend, for instance, held out for 3 years before it fell, so larger armies were needed in order to take these cities. So between 1630 and 1710, the Swedish army doubled in size from 45,000 to 100,000. The French went from 200,000 to 380,000, and Brandenburg Prussia went from 12,000 to 40,000, and this was the same across Europe. The allotment system helped Sweden keep up with the other European powers during this military revolution. And this military revolution could also have formed the basis of the modern-day nation-state. This is because a larger army meant more taxes meant centralization, and centralization meant a stronger government.